It turns out that the relationships between, BW means between, okay? So it turns out that, the relationships between two variables or among multiple variables, there are also different ways to think about it. First of all, we can talk about the relationships between variables, to keep everything simple, right? We now, only talk about or consider situations that have two variables, right? So the first way to think about the relationships between two variables is to think about the shape of the relationship. That sounds a little weird at this moment, but it actually makes sense, right? Later on, we'll see. And the second way to think about the relationships between two variables is to think about the direction of the relationships. Okay, so let's make sense of them. First of all, um, when we're once we talk about the relationships between two variables in terms of shape, we mean this. First of all, we can have linear relationships. That means we can use a straight line to describe how these two variables are related to each other. At the same time, if we say that there's a curvilinear relationship between two variables, we're saying that the two variables, well, the relationship between two variables is best described by a curved line, not a straight line. Okay? See, very straightforward. So linear relationship, if we return to our example, the formidability hypothesis, which describes the relationship between physical strength and how easy you're prone to anger. Um, Previously, we say that it's obviously a linear relationship. Okay, because the relationship between these two variables, variable one, variable two, right? The relationship between these two variables is described by a straight line. And when this line is shooting upward, right? When this line is shooting upward, we say that the two variables have a positive correlation, or variable 1 positively correlates with variable 2, or the correlation between the two variables is positive. Okay? And if we have positive relationships, then of course we have negative relationships. So if you see a line arranged like this between two variables, you will know that this line then denotes a linear negative relationship. It's linear because it's straight line. Oops. It's linear because, first of all, it's a straight line, right? It's negative because it's shooting in this way. But you ask, well, in what way, right? Now let's make sense of it. When we say a relationship is positive, a relationship between two variables is positive, we do not mean that this relationship is good. Positive here does not mean good. Instead, positive here means the values of the two variables are moving in the same direction. Okay? Let me repeat. When we say the relationship between two variables is positive, it means that the values of the two variables are moving in the same direction. That's very easy to see because, again, right, we can have 2 points, point 1, point 2. So if you move from point 1 to point 2, right, essentially you're moving point 1 physical strength from here to here. At the same time, you're moving proneness anger from this point to this point. See, the values of these two variables are moving in the same direction. Or if you go in this direction, it's the same, right? So you will see that now once we're moving from this point to this point, essentially we're moving from here on physical strength to here on physical strength. At the same time, we're moving from here on proneness to anger to here on proneness to anger. So, well, let me use a different color. There we go. Again, we are moving in the same direction. That's why we say this is a positive relationship. Okay? This one describes a negative relationship or negative correlation because exactly the values of these two variables, they move in opposite directions. How so? Well, let's make sense of it. Well, let's say we move in this direction. Okay? Again, we have 1 point, point 1, and point 2. So if we move from point 1 to point 2 in this way, then we're saying we're moving from here on physical strength to here on physical strength. Direction is from, well, let's say from weak to strong. Okay? From negative to positive. But as we're moving in this direction from point to point 2, we are moving on y-axis from here to here. We're becoming less angrier. In this case, we're moving from the positive end to the negative end. Whereas on the x-axis, we're moving from the negative end to the positive end. So these two arrows, they are in opposite directions. That's why this line describes a negative correlation. So let me repeat. When we say two variables, they have negative correlations, it means their values move in opposite directions. Here, moving from negative to positive, whereas here, moving from positive to negative, as we move from point 1 to point 2 on this line. Right? You can do the same by thinking, what if we move in this direction from point 2 to point 1? Can we still reach the same conclusion that this line represents a negative correlation? Right? I'll leave that to you. Okay, so that's positive correlation, that's negative relationship or correlation. Now, another question for you is, what if I want to describe a situation where this variable and this variable have no correlation at all. That means, how can I visualize, to use a straight line, to describe a situation where there's zero correlation between this variable and this variable? Oops, I gave the answer. The answer is a flat line that is parallel to x-axis. Why this makes sense, right? It's because, again, we can designate, 2 points on this line, point 1 and point 2. So again, we say, well, what if we are moving from point 1 to point 2? That means we're getting stronger and stronger, right? Let's say this weak, this strong, right? That means the value on one variable is changing as we move from point 1 to point 2. There's no question about that. But when the value on this axis is changing, the value on the y-axis remains at this point. There's no change because these two, well, we're only moving from this point to this point on a one-dimension line. There's no change in any, vertical direction or diagonal direction, right? There's no change here or here. There's only change in this direction. So we can see, when we say two variables have zero correlations, right? It essentially means that the value of one variable will change, whereas the value of the second variable does not change. That's when we say the two variables have zero correlation, do not correlate with each other at all. So we use a parallel line or straight line that is parallel to the axis to describe this relationship. And you can say that it will be the same if we draw a line that's parallel to the y-axis. It's the same, right? So we have 2 points, point 1, point 2. In this case, as we move from point 1 to point 2, we observe change on this variable. But when we have change on this variable from here to here, we have no change at all on this variable. So again, this straight line will present a case where we don't have any correlations. Okay? So now we can have a sort of a conclusion here. That is, even with the same shape, right? So all these three, relationships, they're all linear relationships, right? It's a linear, straight line, a straight line, a fourth straight line. So they're all linear relationships, but at the same time, these are different relationships because they describe, in this case, a positive correlation, in this case, a negative correlation, and in this case, no correlation. So that's why we say these linear relationships, they differ by directions. Okay? What I have here. Okay. So, we'll conclude this lecture on, verbal descriptions. How we verbally describe the linear relationships that we just, draw. So here we have a first example, right? If we say as income increases, people are sadder, right? So we can say, you know, it's income, it's no money, lots of money. We have happiness here, right? We have sad, happy. So if you plot this relationship, it will be as income increases, people are sadder. So it's a line like this. So therefore, it's a negative relationship. People feel more lonely as they spend more time on Facebook, right? So in this case, we say it's a positive correlation because this is time and this is loneliness, right? There's not lonely at all, there's very lonely. No time spent on Facebook, lots of time spent on Facebook. So it here says, okay, so I switch the place of these two variables, but they're the same, right? Um, whether I place time here or here doesn't matter. Okay, so it says, well, people will feel more lonely. People will feel more lonely as they spend more time on Facebook. It's a line like this. So it's a positive correlation. Okay. Uh, Lastly, I believe, the less time you spend on studying, the lower GPA you will receive. What do you think? Is this a positive correlation or, sorry, a negative correlation? What do you think? The less time you spend on studying, lower GPA you have. Well, while you're thinking, let me, draw out the statement here. So it's um, time. This is loneliness. Lonely, lonely. Damn. Okay. Um, Loneliness. Okay. So we said that it's like this. Okay. More time, more lonely. Okay. So now, the less time you spend on studying, the lower GPA you receive. The correct answer is, oops, this is a positive correlation. Why, you would say? Well, because if we plot it, okay, this is time, this is GPA, right? The sentence said, the claim says, if you spend, well, let's say this less time, this more time, this low GPA, this high GPA, okay? The sentence says, if you spend less time on studying, you will have lower GPA. If you spend less time, you will have, sorry, my mistake. Yeah, well, no, I'm correct, right? So if you spend less time, you will have lower GPA compared to if you spend much more time, you have much more high GPA, less time, lower GPA. This line is exactly the same line as this one. So if this one is positive correlation, we have a positive correlation here as well. Okay? So we'll stop here today and make sure you understand, what we're talking about here, right? So in today's lecture, we elaborate on the definition of variables, right? And say that there are different types of variables. There are categorical variables whose values are discrete, and there are continuous variables whose values are whose values form a continuum. And then we have predictor variables that predicts another variable, and we have outcome variables that are predicted by other variables. And then we looked at the different relationships between variables. We have linear relationships, but we have different types of linear relationships. We have positive linear positive relationships, and we have linear negative relationships. Okay. All right, so make sure you understand all these examples and the exercises that we had, on lecture. And of course, let me know if you have any questions at all. All right, so we'll continue tomorrow to talk about curvilinear relationships and much more on variables. See you tomorrow.